Hi, everyone, and thanks again for joining me for another one of my YouTube videos and Podbean podcasts on the blog Gaudium et Spes 22, which you can find at gaudiumetspes22.com. I'm Dr. Larry Chapp, former professor of theology at DeSales University, and now just a sort of farmer, writer, gentleman, whatever you want to call me. But I'm very thrilled today to have as a guest somebody that probably 90% to 99% of my viewers already know about, and that is Edward Pentin, who is a great, fantastic journalist in my opinion. So I'm thrilled that he agreed to come on the show, and I'm just going to read this very brief description of Ed Pentin for those who don't know who he is. Edward began his career in Rome and you can correct me too if any of this online stuff is not up to date, Edward. He began his career in Rome as a producer and presenter at Vatican Radio before moving on to report for a number of publications, including Newsweek, the Sunday Times, Foreign Affairs, Newsmax, and the National Catholic Register. Articles have covered a broad mix of issues relating to religion, politics, and society. His media appearances have included Al Jazeera, Sky News of the UK, CNN, Fox News, ITV, BBC Radio 4, The World Tonight, and the BBC World Service. He's also been a contributing editor to the Holy Land Review, a Franciscan quarterly specializing in the Church in the Middle East. In 2015, he wrote the highly acclaimed The Rigging of a Vatican Synod, an investigation into alleged manipulation at the Extraordinary Synod of the Family. I've read that. I agree with that. It should be highly acclaimed as a great book. But beyond reporting, he's worked as a researcher and consultant to Lord Alton of Liverpool, one of the world's foremost pro-life campaigners, and as a communications consultant to the Dignitatis Humanae Institute, a pro-life think tank based in Rome. That's just some of his accolades. We could go on and on. Is there anything you want to add to that description, Ed, before we launch into our conversation?
No, it's fine, Larry. Thank you. I have written this other book, of course, The Next Pope, with a team of.
Yes, that's actually listed in there later, and I forgot. So go ahead, mention that book. Mention that book so people can run out and order it now.
Okay, no, it's called The Next Pope: The Leading Cardinal Candidates, and it looks into the 19 leading cardinal candidates who are
Papa. I have not read that book, but I have had conversations with George Weigel. And so I'm already off topic, but now that you bring that up, let's talk about this very, very briefly. I've had conversations with George Weigel about the next conclave because he has strong opinions about that as well, and he is of the opinion, I think, that the votes are just not there for a Pope Francis II to sort of emerge. Do you share that view, or do you think it's just wide open?
Yes, I think that is the general consensus, and that also comes from the late Cardinal George Pell, who was, before he died, he was sort of gauging the interests and the possibilities of who could become Pope, and he was saying before he died that he thought there won't be a sort of Francis II. The College of Cardinals has moved on from the sort of Francis train, as it were, or got off it. Not all of them, of course, but the majority, and they will probably swing back to somebody more conservative, a quieter candidate, somebody who's going to be a sort of safe pair of hands. I think that's the general sense that people say. Those who have in touch with many cardinals will say this, but of course you never really know until the conclave starts.
Well, you never really know, especially I think for many of us in the West. You might be an exception since you have your ear to the ground on so many issues in Rome. But Pope Francis has made so many new cardinals from parts of the world that traditionally haven't had cardinals. And quite frankly, as I survey the landscape and look at some of the names, I'm just scratching my head going, I have zero idea who these guys are and what their sort of theology is. So I have no ability in terms of the empirical data and analyzing it to try and figure this out. Of course.
No, and I think a lot of it's based on sort of conversations with them and what they say, and are they sort of supportive of all of the reforms that are currently being undertaken or not? And I think the other factor, of course, is that a lot of these new cardinals come from the the global south, so often from Africa or the developing world, and they tend to be more conservative, at least theologically, and so that also plays into the possibilities of who could be elected.
Certainly does. So it's and who knows, it could be this year. I mean, the Pope is 86. It could be this year. It could be 10 years from now. Maybe he'll live to be 96 or something, and fool us all and end up being the longest reigning pontiff in human history. Still sitting on the chair of Peter at age 105. Who the heck knows? This is the modern age with modern medicine. So at any rate, but that is a nice sort of segue, though, in discussing who the next Pope might be, to at least focus our attention on the current Pope, which is really what I wanted to discuss with you on here, because you are such an expert in Roman affairs and the papacy and what's going on at the Vatican. And you sent to me today an article that you had posted online that was an interview with Professor Joseph Seifert. And it's called, and you quote him saying, the Catholic Church is in terrible danger of complete collapse. And you later amended this article to point out that he said that, in some countries, not all over the whole world, Catholic Church is in terrible danger of complete collapse in some countries unless cardinals and bishops speak up. And in the course of this article, Professor Seifert is actually very, very critical of not so much, the person Jorge Bergoglio, Pope Francis, but of the policies that he has implemented and some of the teachings that he has promulgated and some of the people that he has promoted. So perhaps you can sort of delve into this article. It's not very long, and I encourage my readers to go look it up. And if I wasn't a total Luddite, I'd flash it up on the screen for people to see the link. But the fact is that this is a tremendously important short little essay, because I've long been an admirer of Professor Seifert. And I know that he's been critical of Pope Francis beginning maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago even. So maybe you could begin by telling us, who is Professor Joseph Seifert, and what is the essence of what he's trying to communicate here to you in this interview?
Right. Well, he's a very respected philosopher. He's a senior lecturer in metaphysics and epistemology at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, which is he's a senior lecturer. He's a very respected figure there. But also he's very well known for his pro-life positions as a philosopher. And he was a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life when that started going rather haywire, and under the leadership of Archbishop Vincenzo Paglia. In 2017, he founded the John Paul II Academy for Human Life and the Family as a sort of counterweight to the Academy. He founded it with others, of course, to be a sort of what the Academy he feels should be, and what it, how it sort of left that vision that John Paul had for the Academy, who set it up. In fact, it was under John Paul that the Pontifical Academy for Life was set up. So he set this academy up. It's done rather well, I think. A lot of the people who are part of it are those former members of the academy who he was with at the time, and they have helped him to set it up. And so it's done rather well. But he's, as I say, he's a pro-life. He's very much somebody who supports the teaching of the magisterium of John Paul II. And that's crucial in his sort of vision and his whole interpretation of the magisterium and the church, especially its moral teaching.
So and so I get this impression. Obviously, he's a philosopher, Catholic philosopher. He's a longtime supporter of Humanae Vitae, Veritatis Splendor, Evangelium Vitae, and so on. The entire range of modern magisterial teaching, especially from JP2, on matters of moral theology, especially in matters of reproduction, sexuality, gender, and these kinds of things. Where is this pro-life institute he started located, before I go on?
Well, I don't think it's sort of located anywhere. I don't think there's any particular base. I guess the base is Germany, perhaps, or somewhere like that. But I think their conferences are held in different places. There was one, I remember quite a few years ago now, there was one in Rome. But
Okay.
yeah, I think it's sort of
So yeah, so it's more like a theological society of like-minded folks who have sort
right.
of come together in meetings now and then sort of probably pool their resources and publish certain things and so on. And so, okay, so that's great. That clears something up that I wanted to know. Now, okay, so what then is your assessment of what happened at the Pontifical Academy for Life? What is your assessment of Archbishop Vincenzo Paglia? What's the end game here? Is it the overturning of Humanae Vitae? Is Professor Seifert therefore correct that Pope Francis wants to, in a sense, modify at least Humanae Vitae in some fashion or another?
Well, it's interesting in that in this article I put up that he talks about the fact that Humanae Vitae really goes to the heart of this, he believes, and that it's really the dissent from Humanae Vitae which is what this seems to be all about, at least to him. And of course, we know that dissent goes back a long way. Ever since it came out, there's been that dissent, and there's been, some would say, the majority of Catholics haven't really subscribed to it. Of course, those who are practicing do, and they see it as prophetic. But I think he sees it as the current pontificate as a sort of re-emergence of that dissent, and that was sort of, in a way, not stamped out totally, but it was certainly not given the upper hand during the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI. And in fact, it was John Paul II's encyclical Veritatis Splendor on the moral teachings of the Church, which really helped to sort of lessen that dissent and act as a counter to all that dissent. It was very much, that was the reason, I think, why it was written. And of course, John Paul II, who Joseph Seifert says new documentation has shown that he was influential in the forming of Humanae Vitae. He, throughout his pontificate, he was keen to sort of stamp down on that dissent, and so he sees this now as a sort of re-emergence of that. I think Archbishop Vincenzo Paglia certainly seems to be on the side of trying to foster a certain amount of dissent from Humanae Vitae. You see it from different comments that he makes,
Yes.
documents that they put out, which have to be then countered by moral theologians. That happened recently. Cardinal Gerhard Müller and Professor Stefan Kampowski wrote a piece for First Things counteracting it. And there's been all kinds of incidents like this where
well, the latest being, of course, he had to walk back some comments he made about the church being able to accept the new euthanasia law that Italy was proposing.
Right. And then, yes, and then it moves on, of course, because I think the argument is if they can't be faithful to Humanae Vitae, for example, they're not going to be necessarily faithful to other what Joseph Seifert calls the non-negotiable teachings, that there are intrinsic evils in these different aspects of life issues such as abortion and same-sex marriage and these issues in euthanasia. So I think he just sees that as it's the kernel of it. I think he sees as the Humanae Vitae one.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And there's this. I'm going to come back to the sort of issue of intrinsic evil in a second, because I think this is a key point that has to be discussed with regard to what it is that the revisionist moral theologians are really going after and what is they seek to change. But before I do that, to me, there's and this is now more on the political level, and this is a level that I think you certainly understand better than I do, because you have your finger on the pulse of Roman ecclesial stuff, as I call it. So to me, what is interesting is this crazy sort of dynamic that we see right now in Rome, where Archbishop Vincenzo Paglia comes out with his latest, well, we can evolve doctrine. So, and you never put a no in front of theology, as he said that a couple of weeks ago. And And then with the Academy for Life, they put out that book that seemed to countenance changes in the teaching on Humanae Vitae, and then now the recent statements on euthanasia. But then, the very next week or the next day, they have to walk it all back. And the Vatican issues a press release then that says, of course, Archbishop Paglia embraces all of the church's teachings and so on. Even his recent thing on euthanasia, he begins by saying, nobody supports Humanae Vitae more than I do. And then he proceeds to show that he, in fact, does not. So there just seem to be all of these internal contradictions. Is there, in other words, is there a battle going on in the Vatican behind the scenes that an average slob like me doesn't really understand or get? What is Pope Francis hoping to gain from this kind of incoherence and this kind of public statement followed by walking it back? What's going on here?
Well, I think a lot of it is to do with obviously the people he's chosen to be around him, like Archbishop Paglia, but many others who are the ones who sort of put him there. I mean, they were the ones who sort of maneuvered him into position at the last conclave, and so they're very keen that this sort of agenda goes forward. It's very much the Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini vision of the church, which is, very much a sort of modernistic modernism of the church. It's very much making it into a church where that he said wanted to be sort of more closer to the world and to be updated. He said it was 200 years behind the times. And so it's all trying to make the church fit into the world and the way the world sees things, especially on moral issues. And this is all part of it. And I think, I think Francis is their man. He's their man. He's the person they wanted to push all this through, and that's what he's doing. And it's been quite visible for many years now. And I think what makes people like Professor Joseph Seifert frustrated and angry about is that few cardinals and bishops are saying anything about it, even though they know that this is not consistent, it's not philosophically acceptable. The law of non-contradiction is broken all the time, and so he sees that as just unacceptable, and that it's amazing to him that bishops and cardinals aren't speaking up. And what really set him off about this letter was that one cardinal said that it was an evil thing to criticize the Pope, and he was a friend of his, and he thought this isn't acceptable. So he wrote a letter to him, which he kindly responded to, but he didn't take any action. And so he then wrote the letter again, but an open letter, and addressed it to all the cardinals of the College of Cardinals, asking them to stand up and speak up against this sort of revolution. He doesn't call it revolution, but many people have.
Yeah, I certainly see it as a revolution, and it's something that I've been writing about for 3 years now, about why is it that we don't see more spine, more, stiff resistance from cardinals and bishops right. to some of the moves of Pope Francis. Once in a while, you'll see, I'd say you see many priests that are willing to do that. And then quite often they get slapped down by their bishop, reprimanded by their bishop, labeled as whatever. And so there is that out there, that this silence from the cardinals and bishops. I do not think that it's because they all agree with Pope Francis and his agenda. I just think it's part of a general reticence for, episcopal leadership. It's in poor form. It's not to criticize the Pope.
Yeah, I think a lot of it too is that they think, oh, well, we'll just stick this out. I mean, I've heard this many times from different prelates and officials. We just need to stick it out. The Pope, no Pope lasts forever, and we'll get a new one, and this will all be, pass under the bridge, but water under the bridge. But it will, this is the way they kind of reason about it and hope that it'll just pass. But I've heard that. I think the first time I heard that was about 6 or 7 years ago, and
yeah. It's still good. That's why I made the comment I did about you never know. He's 86, but maybe he'll live to be, Right. And by the way, I'm not, to all my people who send me hate mail, I am not wishing Pope Francis
No.
to pass on to his great reward. I'm not wishing that at all. I would not wish that on anybody. I'm merely making the empirical observation that it is possible for this Pope to live much, much longer. So it's. I know, in other words, Ed, what you're saying, the attitude is out there among so many conservative Catholics, bishops included, which is we don't really need to make much of a stink about this papacy because after all, he's 86 and he's not going to be around much longer.
Right.
So my point is, hey, don't be so certain of that. You know, in other words, we need to stand up and speak out. You know, you're a journalist and you need to be a little more even keel. I suffer from no such constraints. And so, you know, I'm quite open about the fact that I think this Pope has been overall a bad thing for the church. And so I think there does need to be some respectful, moderated resistance to this, not the kind of Looney Tunes stuff. I don't think Pope Francis is a heretic, but I think that there are trends in this papacy that are dangerous. And that's why I was very interested in what Professor Seifert had to say about this. So what specifically, you know, Professor Seifert says this Pope has instituted a dynamic that's going to change doctrine. Now, we know that he has contraception in view, humanae vitae in view.
Yeah.
Is there, I mean, would he also include in this perhaps changes made to the Eucharistic discipline for the divorced and remarried?
Yes, well, he lists them in this letter, which I linked to in the piece. I don't put it right underneath, but it's quite a long letter. But in that letter that he wrote to the cardinals, he lists various aspects which he sees this pontificate as going off the rails about. He says the first one, I think the one that really is a problem to him, is when Francis made the assertion that God positively wills a diversity of religions, and that was made in the Abu Dhabi Declaration in 2019. And I think he sees that as just, well, it's a lot of people did too. Bishop Athanasius Schneider wrote a letter to him about this, to the Pope about it. I think there was a lot of concern because that does smack of heresy. I mean, if you're saying that
yes,
that God wills the diversity of religions, then that's not acceptable. I think the argument is that I think it's something about the God's passive will allows it, but he doesn't will it deliberately. It's not positively wills, which is what the document says. So there was that. And then he talks about his support for same-sex unions. That's another big issue. The Pope's denial of the existence of acts that are always and everywhere evil, such as adultery, because of his document Amoris Laetitia, which allowed communion in some cases to divorced and remarried Catholics. That he believes, as did the Dubbia cardinals. That's why they wrote the Dubbia. They wanted to know if the Pope really believed that such acts are always and everywhere evil. And then he talks about his false teaching on the death penalty. He believes that the Pope's changed the catechism to say that the death penalty is inadmissible. That is a break with the Church's perennial teachings. The Pope's claim that hell is empty. I don't think he ever said that on the record. I think that was an interview with Eugenio Scalfari, which of course was very controversial because Scalfari never took notes and never recorded the interview.
Which raises the prudential question of why would a Pope grant an interview to an octogenarian atheist journalist who doesn't take notes?
Right, exactly.
Are you not begging for misunderstanding
yes.
in such a context? But I want to go back. Okay, first off, there's so much in there in what you just said. And I don't mean to interrupt if you weren't finished, but I'm glad you mentioned that you did link to the fuller letter from Professor Seifert. You sent me this article like a couple hours ago, and I just did not have time to go and read the longer letter. So I would encourage my viewers, if they access this article, just type in Edward Pentin, Joseph Seifert, Google it, you'll find it. And So I haven't had a chance, but I'm glad that you did link the longer letter, because then it will fill in some of these blanks. So I'm not going to belabor that point, but I want to point to the Abu Dhabi statement then, because I did say, hey, I don't think the Pope is a heretic, but maybe I'm about to just have my mind changed. I don't know. Right here on the air. And I know I have a lot of traditionalist friends who are always after me saying, why can't you see that this Pope is a heretic? Because I don't like calling the Pope a heretic. That's why. It's not in my genetic nature to sit around musing about whether or not the Pope is a heretic. Nevertheless, if he is, he is. Now, okay, so let's get to the Abu Dhabi statement, because I think that on the face of it, of course, I think that not only flirts with heresy, I think it is heresy to say that Christianity is simply one religion among many, that God wills the diversity of religions. First off, that also includes a rather modern, politically liberal notion of what religion is, this reified thing, which is a whole nother debate for a whole nother day, that post-liberal scholars, of course, would have a great deal of issue with. But nevertheless, and I've talked about it on here, nevertheless, is it not true that the Vatican walked that statement back or airbrushed it up after the fact to make it to clarify it, as you just said, that what the Pope meant was God's indirect will is to permit these religions?
I'm not aware of that, Larry. They may have done, but I don't think so, because I know that Bishop Schneider, when he saw the Pope, I think he asked him, will you change it? And I think the Pope said that he would, but I don't know if it has been changed. So
okay, well, that's interesting.
That sentence been changed.
Well, I'm going to have to look into this then, because it was my understanding that they had sort of airbrushed it and changed it to take note of the criticisms. And if they haven't done that, and I will follow up on this, so my viewers will know I'm on the case, guys. I'm going to follow up on this because this is an extremely important point.
Yeah,
it's I mean, it cuts right to the heart of the Christian evangel, to say that God wills all the other religions as equally as he does Christianity. I assume that was kind of implied in the Abu Dhabi statement, not that God wills for a diversity of religion, but I think the implication is that they're therefore all on a kind of equal footing with one another. I mean, is that what you take to be the gist of it?
Well, I think that the key problem was that it seemed to say that God positively wills them, and as I say, there's a passive will and an active will, and I don't think I think him saying that he positively wills is a problem. I think a lot of theologians thought that, but I think the problem also here, though, if I may, is that
go ahead.
When the Pope does make these statements, and if they are corrected, fine, but there's never much publicity, or it's not announced. So the errors get carried along and they're not ever really corrected. And that seems to happen a lot. And it's quite remarkable how, the claim that hell is empty, for example, I don't know if that was ever properly corrected by the press office. So it sort of still stands, you see, it still stands as a statement.
And I'm troubled by that, even though, I'm a specialist in the theology of Hans Urs von Balthasar. That's what I did my doctorate on. And I adhere to some version of Balthasar's view that we can at least hope for the salvation of all. But not even the great Balthasar would have said, hey, hell's empty. We can know that. In fact, he argues decidedly against the idea that we can know for certain that hell is empty, or that hell is populated one way or the other, or even fulsomely populated. So yeah, that's a troublesome comment to come from the Pope. And I remember when he said it, and of course it was in the interview, so it's not de fide definita dogmatic teaching or anything, but still it's deeply troubling. And of course the lack of clarification, as you point out, is sort of a central motif of this papacy, going all the way back to the early days of this papacy with that famous "Who am I to judge?" phrase that never was later, clarified by the Vatican. Hey, we were just talking about repentant sinners and the need to be merciful towards repentance. No, it was immediately taken with the press and run with gay is okay, because the Pope says we're not to judge any of this. And then, of course, he promoted James Martin. He promotes prelates like Cardinal McElroy, who have called for a change in church teaching on homosexuality. He has made Cardinal Hollerich the Relator General of the Synod. He has publicly stated that the church is wrong on homosexuality. He has sent private letters to Sister Gramick of New Ways Ministry here in the United States, two private letters saying that he supports her ministry. So I guess one can reach the conclusion, right, that the Pope is dissenting, or at least actively promoting theological dissent on the issue of homosexuality.
Yes, and let's not forget that I think was it Father Martin sent a dubia to the Pope, and he answered it, I think, the next day. So, it's I think the Pope, I can't remember the exact details, but it was something that needed clarification as far as
the Pope had said something to the effect that homosexuality remains a sin, and in response to a question. And of course, Father Martin immediately wanted to know if the Pope was saying that the orientation itself is a sin, or was sexual activity the sin that he was referring to. And of course, the Pope immediately rushed in and said, the sexual activity is the sin, not the orientation. And then he added, which is something Father Martin didn't even ask for, by way of clarification, the Pope then added, and of course, there are then all kinds of mitigating factors as to just how serious any of these sins are.
Right.
So it does raise. Go ahead.
No, it seems quite clear, though, doesn't it, where his sympathies lie and which gender ideology he seems to be sympathetic to. I don't think there's any sort of doubt about that now. That and those, as I say, those are the people around him who are pushing this, and that's why he's there. I think for large part of the reason for those who got him there want their agenda pushed through, and that's a major part of it, I would say.
Yeah, let's stick for a second, because I'm going to come back to the issue of intrinsic evils. Let's stick for a second on the issue of homosexuality, because of course it's a burning issue that everybody wants to know about these days. I've written in the Register, for which we both write, an article where I pointed out that there is a profound incongruity often between what Pope Francis says on the publicly on the issue of homosexuality and what he does. Of course, he has said that he opposes ideological colonization, that he opposes transgender ideology. He has said that he opposes anything that ideologizes all of this and turns it into a sort of lobby, as he called a movement. But then he turns around, despite all of those words, and then promotes people to high office in the church who completely disagree with those words. And so there is this fundamental incoherence in this papacy, which I think also is driving Professor Seifert crazy. Number one, do you share that assessment that there is an incongruence between his words and his deeds? And if you do share that belief, what does this incongruence mean? Does it mean that the Pope is being deceptive in his words?
Yes. Excuse me. I think a lot of it's to do with his Peronist background, in the sense that the Peronism is about, as far as I understand it, a lot about it's very pragmatic. So if he's speaking to somebody who is of a certain opinion, he will tend to say things which he knows that person will support. And then if he's speaking to somebody else who has a very opposite opinion, he will also go along with that person and whatever they support. So it sounds like he's sort of friends with everybody. But as people have often said, you have to look at the actions that the Pope does. Yes. And his actions obviously speak louder than his words. And his actions tend to be always on the more heterodox side, and very much sort of undermining the magisterium. I mean, there's so many different examples, but I think that's the essence of it. And I think, again, it's because the ones that he really listens to are the ones who put him there, the ones who are very much of that ilk, I would say.
Yeah, I agree completely with that assessment. I'm not certain, though. I'm always a little bit dubious about the Peronist argument. I hear people make this Peronist argument all the time, and that you position yourself. You talk to both extremes, or all sides, and you tell them what they want to hear, and this creates then a sort of destabilization and confusion, and then you position yourself as kind of the personality that has the charism that can hold the whole thing together, that I alone can transcend all of these things, which is why I'm able to speak to all of you with a certain sympathy, even as I transcend it. I think there's a lot of perhaps potential truth in that Peronist argument. There's another point of view that I lean towards, though, too, is that the Pope is simply a sentimentalist, and perhaps doesn't think these things through quite as deeply as maybe we think that he does. And he is simply kind of speaking to people what he thinks they want to hear, because it's a feel-good thing to do. I don't know. That's another possibility that I often, toss out there. I'm not certain if it's true or not. Perhaps the Peronist one is true. But nevertheless, what it boils down to is a deep incoherence at the very heart of this papacy, which is a shame, because it seems to me that the function of the Petrine ministry is to unify by clarifying, not to disunite by muddying the waters, which is exactly what he seems to be up to, is disuniting by muddying the waters.
Yes, well, I think it's all part of a sort of strategy, if you like. I mean, I agree with you. There is a certain sentimental element to that, but I think there's also a strategy behind it too. And I think that is sort of to throw up conflicting signals and confusion, and that way you get through an agenda and a vision and a direction that he wants to go. I think that's sort of, I'd say that's certainly part of it. He's very politically minded. He's very he knows how to handle things politically. He's very astute in that regard. And I think he's well aware of what he's doing.
Well, you don't have to agree with what I'm about to say next, because one of the reasons why I shy away from those kinds of arguments is because it leads me to the conclusion that the Pope is deceptive, that he's not being entirely truthful, that he's mendacious, and that's a sin, right? That's a sinful intellectual activity for him to be engaging in, and shame on him for doing so. But that's why I sort of avoid strategizing about this, saying, okay, this is what he has to say the orthodox stuff to placate this wing of the church, all the while he's working over here to undermine the whole edifice. Well, that means what he's saying to these guys over here by way of placation is a lie, that it's not true. And that too is something that should cause us pause with regard to this papacy. Now, I don't expect you to jump on and agree with that assessment, but I want to come back then to the issue of the divorced and remarried in Amoris Laetitia. I know Professor Seifert brings this up as well, and the fact that the Pope has never answered the four dubia cardinals, even though he's quick to answer a James Martin. Just as he has time to meet with drag queens at St. Peter's, and he has time to meet with NBA stars from the United States, but he didn't have time to meet with Cardinal Zen when Cardinal Zen was in Rome. It seems as if, right, this is another one of his actions where he has no issue with simply, as the kids would say, dissing the conservative element in the church and just send them packing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's I think quite openly the case. I think he sees moderates as really those sort of on the more sort of heterodox wing, and conservatives as sort of on the extreme side. That seems to be what he says. I mean, he said it privately, and so I think that is the way he sees things. And it's interesting how I think from the get-go he was like this, and there's something about the sort of conservative, certainly American as well, I think, which kind of triggers him a little bit. And I think he just doesn't He just
I'm
doesn't like it. Whatever background, whatever has been in his past, which does this, it seems to upset him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe we're ignoring the fact. I mean, he may be a Peronist, but never admit that he's, a South American. And so I've
Right.
detected what I think
Right.
is a generalized dislike for the Anglophone world in general, but for the United States in particular, you know.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that Traditionis Custodes, for example, is in great measure a response to the fact that the outside of France, the largest devotees of the traditional Latin Mass were some rather very conservative English speaking types in the UK and in the United States. And
Yeah.
I mean, he allows all kinds of craziness to go on with regard to the Mass of Paul VI. He just recently said, well, the reason why I put down the Latin Mass is because it was being ideologized, as if the Mass of Paul VI hasn't been ideologized for 60 years by all kinds of far left factions in the church. As I said in my recent Register article, every rainbow colored Mass, every pride Mass in the church is already a hyper ideologized liturgy of some kind. But Pope Francis seems to have zero issue with rainbow liturgies and big issue with English speakers doing the Latin liturgy. I mean, do you agree with that assessment?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think part of it's to do with the fact that, yes, there's that sort of anti-Americanism, if you like, or anti-Anglo position that he has, and anti-conservative. But also, I think he realizes, and I think the people around him also realize, that the traditional Mass is a real obstacle to his agenda and to the revolution. And I think that's why there's a sort of vehemence to try to stamp it out, because they see that really as the main hindrance to going forward with this agenda.
Well, I say that's weird. I mean, I say that exact thing in my last issue in the Register. Wait a minute. No, that's my next article coming out in the Register. That when I'm dealing with liturgy. But anyway, I'm mixing up all my various Register articles. But the fact is, yes, he has said that that the Latin Mass people are contrary to Vatican II, and that's why he's doing so. A lot of this, it seems to me, is an attempt at not so much that he is all that concerned with liturgy as such. It's all about controlling the narrative of Vatican II. It's all about, and I've written on, I don't remember where I've written on this, Catholic World Report of the Register. It's all about furthering this narrative of what I call the council interrupted. That we had the council, a certain dynamic was set in place where the progressives begin to take charge of things. Paul VI seemed very amenable to that, despite Humanae Vitae. Then all of a sudden, it stops, and we get these two reactionary dullards, Wojtyła and Ratzinger, who, even though they were at the council, didn't understand it and immediately hated it and immediately tried to roll back all of its reforms. But now, finally, we have the dear leader. Finally, we have the great revolution taken up yet again. So a great deal of what we're seeing is simply a recrudescence of 1970s style progressive theology. And so putting down the Latin Mass is a constitutive element in the retrieval of this narrative.
Right. And it's interesting how he uses this sort of I don't know, the ad hominems, or whatever you'd call them, criticisms of the traditional Mass, which really apply to the agenda that he's pursuing. I mean, saying that it's sort of backward, where you don't get backward and going back to the 1970s. I mean, that's really what they're doing. I think that's the argument that they're doing. Whereas, of course, the traditional Mass is getting more support from young people, as we saw this weekend in Chartres in France. The huge numbers of pilgrims going on the traditional pilgrimage there, young pilgrims, 16,000. And so the future is there. It's not with the sort of stuck in the 70s sort of vision of the council, or at least their interpretation of the council. So yeah, I think it's definitely a scene. I think it's definitely a sort of attempt to stamp it out, because it is this great obstacle to their sort of progressive vision.
Yeah, and to not stamp it out is to admit that there isn't one single way, their way of interpreting the Second Vatican Council and the
Right.
reforms that it called for. And in particular, perhaps even the liturgical reform, especially. I mean, one would be hard pressed to read Sacrosanctum Concilium and then to look at the Mass of Paul VI and say, yeah, that's what the council wanted.
Right.
You
Right.
know, so you have to kind of create this narrative of that the council, you know, its spirit. What they mean when they say the spirit of Vatican II is that, you know, the rupturists believe that what was important about the council was simply the event that it created. The event itself
Yeah.
creates a historical dynamic that is the Holy Spirit at work. Forget what the council actually says. That doesn't matter. What matters is the trajectory as an event that the council instituted. And so oftentimes conservatives, in arguing against the progressive narrative, think that, oh, well, all I have to do is quote the council to prove how wrong they are in their narrative. And it's utterly beside the point. They don't give a darn about what the council actually says.
Mm-hmm.
Go
But you
ahead.
could argue, I don't know if you want to get into the whole council argument, but I think Cardinal Casper admitted that it was written in a sort of ambiguous way so that it could be sort of misinterpreted and interpreted in a way which the liberals would want. And you see that also in the synods that we see today, and that they're sort of ambiguously written like Amoris Laetitia. And so they're interpreted in the way that you know, those who were pushing this agenda have intended from the beginning. And I think it's a sort of the same model being repeated throughout, and that's why I think some people say, well, this pontificate really is the natural sort of conclusion of the council, in the sense that it's sort of bringing forward the sort of things that those who deliberately made the council documents ambiguous wanted from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with what Cardinal Casper said, and I'm familiar with that argument. I'm not entirely certain I agree with it, though. I'm not completely on board. The Vatican II was hopelessly ambiguous in key points train. I'm not entirely on that train,
Yeah.
and I think that, especially in light of the magisterially authoritative pontificates of John Paul and Benedict, that gave us a magisterial orientation to how to properly interpret those conciliar documents. I think that further adds further weight to the idea that the council may not have been as ambiguous as some of its critics claim. On both the right and, of course, the traditionalists claim the same thing. Yes, the council is deadly ambiguous, and that's what has led directly to Pope Francis. And of course, the rupturists agree with that completely. I'm more in the communio school of thought that sees discontinuities and continuities. But anyway, that's a whole different conversation for a different day, Ed. And we're sort of running low on time here. But I want to come back then to this letter of Professor Seifert and the things that he has listed that he thinks, because I think this is the key thing we want to talk about. Forget the council and whether it was good or whether it was bad, but is Pope Francis promoting people, and he himself, the views that are heretical? So I want to come back to the death penalty question, and his claim that the death penalty is now completely inadmissible. I say in my latest book, you know, that this is strange given the fact that at one time the church herself actually executed people, and now we have a scenario where the church is saying, no, you that's completely inadmissible. What's interesting, of course, is he avoids the language of intrinsic evil. He doesn't say the death penalty is intrinsically evil and therefore always everywhere. No, immoral. He simply says, in a phrase that I don't think has much ecclesiastical pedigree, he calls it inadmissible. Is that a significant thing that he doesn't say intrinsic evil, it says inadmissible instead? Is that simply a slippery way of saying that it's intrinsically evil?
Well, this is what respected philosophers like Edward Feser says, I believe, that because he didn't go that far, but Edward Feser, I think, still believes that it was a wrong.
Yes, he does. I read his latest piece. Yeah.
Yes, but I think the fact that he didn't, because I think he believes that it's almost, he might as well have said intrinsically evil, but I think that he deliberately stepped away from saying that precisely because that would have been a step too far, and But yeah, I think it's interesting how, I mean, another part of this pontificate, I'd just say briefly that the Pope, he's very authoritarian in that sense. I mean, he will, although he wants sort of synodality and everything, when he wants to do something and change something, he'll just do it unilaterally, like this with the catechism, which is quite telling, really. Yeah.
And I mean, we could talk. I could talk to you for hours. We could have another show on synodality and
Yes.
another show on the German synod, synodal vague,
Right.
because we're sort of running out of time. But a discussion then of synodality is not outside of boundaries here in terms of going too far off the tracks of a discussion of Pope Francis, because he's initiated this thing. Now, Vatican II did speak of collegiality, and it did even speak of the creation of perhaps of national episcopal conferences and so on. But this synodality thing is something different, and quite frankly, given the actions of this papacy, which in many ways are, as you pointed out, autocratic, in many ways anti-synodal. How anti-synodal is Traditionis Custodes? How anti-synodal is it? So the Vatican now claims the right to micromanage what you can and cannot put into a parish bulletin about the Latin Mass times in your parish. How is that synodal? The removal of the bishop in Puerto Rico, I can't remember his name, without any canonical sort of procedure or anything for unknown reasons. And of course, one could go on and on and on. So it leads one to the conclusion that the synodal process is a conclusion in search of cover, a conclusion in search of arguments. The faux democratic processes are curated from above, manipulated from above. The deck is stacked from above in order to get the prearranged results. This is clearly what the Germans have done. Okay, they disempowered all the conservative voices and empowered all the liberal ones. And is this not what's happening in the synodal way in general?
Yeah, I think you've nailed it. I think it is a sort of cover for pushing through an agenda. I mean, I've spoken about this. I've written about how the synods are really sort of vehicles for heterodoxy.
Yeah, your book on the synod and the family was fantastic because
nice.
Go ahead.
No, I just think it's from the beginning and from those synods we could see it, and you've just seen it confirmed throughout each synod that we've had. And this sort of idea of a permanent synod, which is Cardinal Martini's dream that he had, of having a sort of permanent synod, really is a sort of ersatz sort of council. It's a sort of third Vatican council, which they're sort of putting through as a synod, because if it's constantly in play and the church's teaching is also always sort of up for grabs and up for development, then it's like a sort of Vatican Council that's sort of never ending. And I think
a Vatican Council without the nettlesome problem of having to deal with actual bishops.
Exactly. Yes. It's now not called the Synod of Bishops anymore, by the way. It's called the Synod, which it's sort of rather discreetly being changed, that it's not actually called.
Well, this raises but it's because now the Pope has said that lay people are going to be in the Synod on Synods, and that they are going to have voting rights. And so how can you then possibly call it the Synod of Bishops when it is not really just exclusively with bishops anymore? And I know Father Gerald Murray has just recently written an article where he says, of course, this goes contrary to canon law as to what a Synod of Bishops should be, so on and so forth. But my response to that would be, even if that is true, the Pope can do whatever the heck the Pope wants. The Pope can, right? Am I wrong about? I mean, the Pope can go against any canon he just darn well feels like going against. So if the Pope wakes up in the morning and says, I want lay people voting at the Synod of Bishops, and so the Synod of Bishops is now not really a Synod of Bishops anymore, it doesn't matter what canon he's violating, right?
Right, exactly, yeah. But this has been a problem with his pontificate, that I think a lot of people have been concerned about the fact that he's, just it's become sort of lawless, and the fact that he sort of tramples over canon law and just does whatever he wants when it suits him, but then invokes canon law when it suits him too, which when it comes to the traditional wing, for example.
Was that not one of the posthumous things that came out that apparently allegedly Cardinal Pell had said about this papacy,
Yes,
that it was lawless?
exactly. That was one of his big concerns, because I remember talking to him about it shortly before he died, and he was very concerned about the lawlessness. He was hoping for a successor who would bring the law back into the Vatican and back into the running of the church. He saw it as a real problem. Yeah.
Well, it was a great privilege, obviously, for you to know Cardinal Pell so well and to have the opportunity to converse with him, especially since he passed.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, I was never a huge Cardinal Pell fan way back in the day when he first sort of hit the scene. No big reason why. He just didn't, move me that much. But I gained enormous respect for him in the way he conducted and carried himself in light of the absolutely atrocious way in which the Australian judicial system treated him.
Yeah, yeah. And he came back a different man, actually. I mean, when he came back to Rome, he was very humbled, I think, by it, and yeah, it certainly had a mysteriously positive effect, of course, as these things do, as suffering does.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
He was different. Yeah, he's
Okay.
much missed. It was very
Yeah.
untimely death. Yeah.
In many ways, as George Weigel once said to me, in some ways, the church has lost among the College of Cardinals. It's lost its quarterback.
Right.
It lost
True.
its quarterback because Cardinal Pell was really kind of coming into his own, really, in many ways, as a mover and a shaker behind the scenes, as an influential sort of person with many, many fellow cardinals who respected him and so on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, well, we've been going at this for almost an hour. Are there any issues with the Francis pontificate that we haven't covered that you might want to bring up here before we sort of? I have no hard and fast time where I have to cut this off, but I know your time is limited, and so I don't want to presume upon your time. But go ahead.
No, just Larry. I think it's quite interesting to reflect on where this is all leading, and what perhaps the Lord is going to, what he wants, what his plan is for all of this. And I think it's interesting that we've excuse me, we've seen a great sort of in a way you could argue it's a sort of purification of all the sort of modernism and dissenting thinking and heresies that have sort of cropped up over the last decades. And maybe this is just a means of sort of purifying the church and getting rid of all of that, so that the church gets back to being truly apostolic and faithful to the magisterium. And that could well be where we're heading, and which means that there could be more problems, more suffering to come. But at the end of the day, that's the good that could come from it, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, to go back to end in a sense where we started with the Professor Seifert article, and he says we're going to witness in certain countries, a complete collapse of the church. I have no doubt that he has in mind Europe, North America, in particular. And I think all the signs are there for anybody who has a lick of sense to see. Especially as we hemorrhage young people out of the church, and marriages are way down, baptisms are way down, and so on. You get the metrics are all bad, the demographics are bad, and you just get this palpable sense, if you have any kind of gut instinct at all, that things are not only trending down, they're kind of going off the cliff as we speak. And my issue with that, therefore, to go back to Professor Seifert and to then Joseph Ratzinger's statement in like the late 60s about the church going to shrink and become a smaller, holier church. My point is that this is then precisely what is wrong about the pastoral response of Pope Francis and, say, the Germans, where essentially you're saying, we're losing Catholics in Western culture. Therefore, the answer to that is to double down on modern political liberalism, on modern cultural liberalism, and to accommodate the church like a chameleon to this culture, in my view, which doesn't recognize the toxic nature of this culture to the faith, or that where this model has been tried among the Protestants, it has utterly failed.
But you could argue, though, Larry, that is a sort of that sort of dynamic has to see itself through in order to show,
Yes.
some ways say, the bankruptcy of the current leadership, and that in order to show everyone how just bankrupt it is, it's got to go the full length, and you've got to see how it's just totally
Oh,
not
yes,
going
I agree with
forward.
you completely. I was not disagreeing with your assessment at all.
Oh, sorry,
That
no, I just
Yeah, that I was just sort of dotting an I and
kind of
crossing a
add to it.
T with regard to the beginning of the
Yeah.
article. That yeah, I agree with you completely. We're going to see much harsher times ahead and leaner times ahead, and we're going to see a great diminishment of the church, and we just need to acknowledge that this is what's going to happen. And it's not until we sort of hit rock bottom, and the
Right.
only people that are left are those who have apostolic zeal and true Catholic faith,
Yeah.
that we can slowly, brick by brick by brick, and hopefully build it up. And hopefully by then, the broader culture as well will have
Yes.
come to see the bankruptcy of modern nihilistic secularism,
Indeed.
and then be more open and ready for a re-evangelization
Yes.
of those cultures.
Indeed. I think that could well be it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I can't thank you enough, Ed, for coming on here. This is actually our
Thank
first
you.
time meeting face to face. I'm going to be in
Yeah.
Rome. My wife and I are going to be in Rome next week. I think the last time I was in Rome, it was Pope Benedict's funeral. We didn't get a chance to meet up, and we probably won't next week either. But so
Right.
it's great meeting you face to face.
You too, Eric.
Finally,
Thank
I've
you
been a
very much.
great admirer of your work. I read your stuff all the time. And when
Thank
you
you.
agreed to come on my show, it's like, hey, wow, that's fantastic. I get to talk to Ed. And
Well,
I
it's an
know
honor for me too. Yeah.
and I know my viewers and listeners feel the same. So thank you so much, Edward Pentin,
Thank you, Eric.
Catholic journalist and intellectual extraordinaire, in my view. Thank you for coming on. It's been an absolute joy. And thank you, everybody, for listening. And until next time.